I know you may think this is a conspiracy, but it's a slippery slope from freedoms to communism. There is a person who is named Dr. Dissenter. Oh, no, I'm sorry. This brilliant economist statistician is named Dr. Genevieve Briand, and I hope I got her name pronounced correctly. And she did a lecture on November 11th for her students, in which she downloaded data from the CDC website. And in this video, she shows how she downloaded the data. Now, Johns Hopkins silenced her in a couple ways. The lecture was on the 13th. This was supposedly posted on the 11th. The video was posted on the 13th, and it had 33,000 views. And Johns Hopkins, JHU Advanced Academic Programs, made this video unlisted. You're going to hear some noise in a second. Oh, never mind. My Robo-Rocket smart vacuum finished. But my helper picked it up and picked up the robot. Anyways, Dr. Genevieve Briand is not a medical doctor. It's common in universities and in the world of education to call people doctor when they have a PhD. A doctorate in a particular study means they have spent immense hours studying their specialty. And it turns out that Dr. Genevieve Briand not only has a doctorate, but she also has a master's. She's the director of the master's program in applied economics. So Dr. Genevieve Briand has multiple degrees, actually, and from multiple institutions. And her focus is statistics in some areas, and economics, etc. Now, it doesn't take a medical doctor to look at data. In fact, most of you have spent your life looking at data. Here is me back in, I think 2011, before my Dane Bramage and my wheelchair need. And my brain is much slower now. One of the issues that Johns Hopkins came up with when they took an article written by Yanni Gu, sorry Yanni if I mispronounced your name, where Yanni takes the video and writes out an article based on the lecture, showing some of the graphs and the tables and talking about the content of the lecture. The lecture is fantastic. I recommend you watch it. The article was done well, but Johns Hopkins is, and yeah, I know this seems like a strong statement, but they're part of ushering in the Communist Party. What do I mean by that? Well, in communism, you don't have freedom of speech. And for a university such as Johns Hopkins to deny a professor free speech is really inhibiting the freedom of academic exchange. In their retraction, Johns Hopkins took her article down and wrote that the article written, by Yanni about Dr. Briand's lecture has been used to support dangerous inaccuracies that minimize the impact of the pandemic. Wow, try to unpack that. Support dangerous inaccuracies. So that's kind of like saying somebody who writes a book about how to make a wheel for a car needs to be shut down because somebody used that car to run over somebody else. There's just no connection here. But the curious thing for me is about dangerous inaccuracies. – It's as if data can be dangerous. It's as if inaccuracies can be dangerous. Now, I'm assuming since Johns Hopkins is silencing a person who has expertise in analyzing data, they know what the word accurate means. Here's a graphic I created many years ago when I was teaching physics laboratories, which I did for nearly 20 years. They're still using my curriculum. This is a target with arrows, okay? And accuracy is not represented here, but the next one down, where the center of the target is, well, that's the target. You want to hit the center. And all the arrows are kind of surrounding, describing that center. Up here, all the arrows are not describing the center. They're off to one side. This one is not accurate, but it's precise. And so precision is how many decimal places you can measure to. That's another example of precision. And this is both precise and accurate. All the arrows are almost on top of each other. Precision. And they're all at the center of the target. Okay, I had to make lots of graphical representations of things for the students. And here is one of my last lectures that I gave on measurements and uncertainties. And it's about an hour and a half plus 7 minutes long. But you all know about data. It doesn't matter who you are. You know about data, and the kind of data that Dr. Briand is dealing with in this article is something that anybody can do in the sense of recognizing counts. Let's count. When did you start to learn to count? You were a child, I'm assuming. Somebody put out marshmallows and you counted the marshmallows. And, well, the first thing that's covered in this article by who I'm naming Dr. Dissenter because she's going against the authority of Johns Hopkins. They disagree with her. We can't allow someone to post an article, do a lecture. The first data that she displays is this graph. Now, what this graph is representing in Dr. Briand's lecture is data from the CDC, okay? And she had a question. If COVID is really as bad as what people are saying, and there's the rub with Johns Hopkins and with the 2020 Democrat Party, they have a rub against this idea because Dr. Briand said if there's going to be all these deaths, we should see something in the data. Okay, and this is real data from the CDC. This is not estimates. The CDC does both. For some things, they do estimates, and for others, they collect data. And so this is data, real deaths in February to September. Okay? And what we should see in this upper age category right here, where 100% of deaths in that week can be broken down into different age groups. COVID was supposed to be really dangerous for the elderly, and it is, okay, I'm not denying that. But if it has the numbers that have been spoken, we should see this blue section right here, which is the percent of deaths in a given week that are from ages 85 and older. And let's go down to 75 and older. So let's consider both the blue and the orange. And what we should see is these bars should be much bigger than the rest during all this time. And in fact, in April, when the most deaths were happening, we should see this section in here where the blue and the orange take up most of the deaths. I know that's a hard concept to put together, but let me try to say it a different way. If the deaths from COVID were really as they were being reported, not only today, but back in March, April, when there was the biggest hit, the hit should have impacted those oldest among us. And therefore, we should see in this region blue and orange taking over most of this percentage. But we don't see that. Instead, we see this natural wave throughout here, which is part of just seasonal deaths. Okay, now, have I scrambled your brain enough? The article, the lecture that Dr. Brienne gives, she produced this plot, which is a brilliant plot. You see down here, there's 3 different legends, four different sections where the legends are. So there's a green and a yellow line represented here, and that's disease of the heart. Why is that a focus? Well, because heart disease is the primary cause of death in the United States of America. And then this is cancers, the yellow. And then there's other types of diseases that cause death. Okay, and what you see is 2 things that Dr. Brienne points out in her lecture. You see a wiggle in the data a wave in the data, that represents seasons of the year. And then she shows over a period of 6 years that there's this increase in death. In other words, our death rate is going up in time. And Dr. Briand, I found her to be a very humble person, not a proud PhD piled higher and deeper, but a person who just presents what she can find, and then she herself asks questions. And she submits this data to the community and says, hey, let's have other people look into this in different ways. So there's about close to 1,000 deaths per year increase every year. So it means every year 908 or 1,000 more people are going to die. And then there's this spike that happens, in about April, March or April. And it's a spike of about 11,000. Now, we were already expecting the spike to go up by about 1,000, so we could say there's a 10,000 spike here. Now, something else of interest, there's COVID deaths that are downloaded also from the CDC, and I share Dr. Brienne's curiosity. Earlier I used the word wiggle, and that's the little wiggle here. Okay? Because it's not smooth data. People die when people die, and it's a tragedy every single death. And so there's wiggle in the data because it's not a smooth curve. Okay? There's more one day and less another day of deaths. But look at this COVID data from the CDC. Smooth curve. In physics, we would teach our students, even in the introductory lab courses, that if you ever saw smooth data like this, it's probably manufactured, meaning it's created with calculators, with computer equations, with formulas. It's probably not real data. And that's very curious. Now, what Dr. Briand shows through the data is even more curious. These are the worst weeks in April that we've discussed with that peak. And really, the Democrats, the liberals in the United States of America and worldwide, and including the Communist Party, have created a miracle with COVID-19. I called this graphic that Dr. Brienne created. She made this table for her discussion, Miracle on 34th Street. Because I think that was the show. An old movie. COVID has gotten rid of all other deaths. If you look at the total COVID deaths, they actually silence all the other deaths from heart disease, cancer, blah, 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 blah. In fact, the COVID deaths show that only about 21 people died in this given week from all these other diseases. It appears from this data that COVID took the responsibility for deaths that would have happened anyways. Interesting. Now, in her data analysis, Dr. Brand has a couple screens at the end of a recap and a conclusion. And there's nothing political about this. There's nothing erroneous about this. It's just, this is what the data shows. It's interesting that the deaths of children is less for this year than the 5 previous flu seasons. And yet all our schools are closed. She didn't say that. That's what I'm saying. And my statement is part of what Johns Hopkins calls a dangerous inaccuracies that minimize the impact of the pandemic. Well, actually, the data is looking at the impact of the pandemic. And it's showing that maybe we've been lied to by the Democrat Party. Now, Dr. Briand says there's no alarm here, that there's no net change in the age group deaths in the ratios. So this plot right here, we should have seen blue and orange taking up a huge section of this in April or any month of this year, but we don't. It's consistent. The normal number of deaths, all deaths per week, is still about 60,000. So the total number of deaths per week is still about 60,000 throughout the whole year. We would have seen a spike. Okay? Total deaths is an important number to look at because it gets so confusing with all the other data that's being produced. You see the Democrats talking about cases. And then they sometimes talk about deaths. But they're not looking at the overall deaths per week. This one is over a year. And this one is over 6 years. The total death rate is how we can really look at a pandemic to see if it's really having the impact. An increase of 10,000 here is the most that we might be able to find. Now, she explains in her lecture that despite heart disease being the leading cause of death in 2020, the deaths from heart disease are less than the deaths in 2018. Now that's a double miracle. One, because we see from this other graph that the death rate in America is increasing by almost 1,000 deaths per year more each year. And in that increase, there's other plots that she shows. She zooms in here on the heart. This peak right here is lower than this peak for the heart disease. So the idea here is that COVID has created a miracle, and not as many people are dying from heart problems. And in fact, when COVID death numbers were at the highest, all the other major causes of death were at the lowest. So it's a question that Dr. Briand was posing in the end. This is when she zooms in on the heart and shows that there's a decrease here from 2018 to 2020. In academics, we're supposed to ask questions. It's called hypothesizing. And then in physics, we would do an experiment. For an economist or a statistician, they process data, counts. They count up the number of people who've died, and tragic is each one. And then they look at it. Well, Johns Hopkins silenced her. Silenced really Yanni too. Silenced her by unlisting her video. And then they wrote this silly explanation of why they did this. And here they're saying, well, we put a PDF up. You can click here and go to it, or you can go to web.archive.org and find this article. It says Brienne's study should not be used exclusively. And yes, Johns Hopkins owns this material. It's their website. I don't want to own it. Should not be used exclusively. Okay, I agree. In understanding the impact of COVID-19. Well, I agree, but instead, Johns Hopkins silenced her. They said it can't even be used. So I agree with this statement, but their actions are actually contrary. So this statement is it's a lie. Because they're making themselves sound so great. Hey, we're going to do academic freedoms here. Freedom of exchange of thoughts. This professor says this, and this professor says this, and they're different in thought. So now let's see what a third professor says and a fourth professor says. And now let's combine all those thoughts and decide which one has more merits, which one has less merits. But instead, Johns Hopkins silences Dr. Brienne. They unlisted her video so that people can't find it. That's what unlisted means. And then they hid the article as a PDF. And they put a watermark on the PDF. Where is that? Okay, retracted by the newsletter. This is an insult to a PhD. I don't know if Brienne is insulted. She seems like a